Welcome to Podcast Answers. That's right. This is the show where I help people start and grow their podcast, answering any podcasting questions along the way. That's right. We are back with a new episode. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody who is in the U.S. I hope you're spending some time with your families. And if you're talking about podcasting and you're thinking about starting a podcast, I can help you do that. I provide consulting for podcasting and full service options from editing to posting to promoting. Whatever you need to do with your podcast, I do it. And so if you're with your people this weekend for Thanksgiving and you start talking about podcasting, because, you know, who doesn't start about talking about podcasting when they're hanging out with their family? What else do you have to do, right? I mean, eat turkey, talk about podcasting. If you want to start a podcast, I can help you. Podcastanswers.com/contact is the place to do that because, again, I want to get everybody started a podcast because podcasting is fun. So today, though, we are talking about navigating legal issues and copyright issues. So we're talking today, when you start a podcast, there are things that you need to think about because you could get into some major trouble if you don't take those things into consideration. So first thing we're going to be talking a little bit today is about music. And that's going to be, you may be tempted to put things like AC/DC Back in Black on your podcast, but I would not recommend doing that because you will get in trouble for it. You may think no one's going to be listening to it, and you may think that you don't have to worry about anything, but that is not true. That is not the case. You will get in trouble for it. So there are some ways around it. There is lots of royalty-free music that you can use. One of the ones, and that's actually where I found the music for this podcast. That's this track here is actually something from YouTube Music, not YouTube Music, but YouTube has a music selection that they allow you to use underneath your tracks and underneath your videos. And I've been able to, I've used it for this podcast too, because I am broadcasting this podcast on YouTube currently as I do it live because I like having a live podcast. It's a lot of fun. But you can use YouTube to get some royalty-free music that you can use. Other places that you can use it for also are pond5.com. You can buy a track there. One of the things is that you have to watch out with YouTube Music is sometimes you have to do attribution on it, meaning you have to listen. You have to put in, who the artist is in your episode description. But the other thing to do is, pond5.com is a great place. You can buy a track. I've been able to buy a track for one of my other podcasts, and you can just use it as you play your podcast, because once you buy it, it's legally yours to use as long as that's what as long as that you've been able to clear that with Pond5. There's lots of more different websites for that too, though. You can use Epidemic Sound, and that's going to be a subscription. So Pond5 is used by the track. You go in and you listen to it, you say, hey, I want to buy this track, and you buy the track and you're able to use it. With with Epidemic Sound, that's a subscription, and you basically pay a monthly subscription, and as long as you're paying that, you can continue to put tracks from their library into your podcast and listen and have that as your sounds. And you can change that up if you want to do different sound for tomorrow. Next episode, you can change that episode up. You change that artwork up from Epidemic Sound. And so again, that's a subscription, but it clears you. And what you do with Epidemic Sound is you clear channels. So you say, YouTube, I want to clear my YouTube channel, so that way they know when someone or YouTube's algorithms report it, that you're clear to use it because you have a subscription. So again, music is one of the big things that we have to think about royalty free. I would stay away. I've heard things where people say, I can use it, fair use. I'm going to play 10 seconds of, AC/DC Back in Black. And I just would not do that because you are going to get copyrighted every time. And you don't want to do that. You don't want them to take that down. And so you're definitely going to want to not use anything under the guise of fair use, just because that's something that I would stay away from. Now, the next thing that I would warn you about is having your guests sign a release form. So yes, you may have your guests come on and your guests may say, "Yes, I want to be on your podcast." But then next, a week from now, they may come back and say, "No, I didn't really like that," or "I don't give you permission for it." And they can take you to court on that. And so I would have them sign a release form, and that way they are held to, you can take, that's a legal contract you can take and say, "No, you've signed this release form that I own this media. Were a guest on my show. There was no exchange of anything for it, value for it, but you were a guest on my show." And so that allows you to say, "No, you've released that episode and what you've set out." Now, some people take that a step further and say, I will edit it and you can listen to the podcast before I release it. But for me, what I do is I have people sign my release form, which basically says anything that you've said on the show can and will be on the show. Now, I usually tell them afterwards, if you decide, right after the show that you shouldn't have said that it's okay to go ahead and contact me. I will edit it out as long as it's before the release of the episode. So have them sign a release form. And then what I would do is also on your own, edit out anything that you think might cause legal issues. So let's say your guest said something that later when you're editing, you say, "I don't know legally if I should put that in my show," because it's just there's just a little bit of controversy on it, or it may come back to bite me. So you as the editor have the right to edit those things out. And you should, if you think it may cause legal issues, because you as the publisher can be held responsible for it. Now, if you are contacted later about an episode, consider taking it down. I had one in one of my podcasts where a previous guest came in and said, "I would really appreciate if you would take this episode down because of XYZ." And so I considered it. I said, "I'm your friend. We're friends, and I care about you, because if I didn't take it down, yes, I didn't legally have to take it down, but I took it down because I care about the person and I didn't want them to get hurt over what was said in the podcast. Yes, they were responsible for what they said, but ultimately I cared more about my friendship. And so I took that episode down." So again, consider that. It's not that big of a deal if later you need to come back and take an episode down. Now, be careful for what you say too in your podcast, because you could be held liable for things that you say. And libel is basically where you say in a way that you publish a false statement and it's damaging to a person's reputation. So let's say you said something about a famous person and it was a false statement and it damages their reputation. They can come back and sue you for libel. And so just make sure that what you're talking about, you can't be held liable in any way. Make sure that you have 100% true statements and don't say anything that could be damaging to a person's reputation, even if you think it may be true, because you can be held responsible for that. Now, the last thing that I would say you need to be careful with as far as legal issues go, and again, all of these things are coming from me. I am not a lawyer, and so I don't know what you can and can't 100% be sued on, because I'm not a lawyer, and will give you a recommendation on a lawyer that's good with podcasting in case you want one or need one. But the last thing that I would say to consider is in naming your podcast, don't use products or company names in the title of your podcast unless you are that company. So don't call yourself the Coca-Cola Fan Club. Even if you say the Coca-Cola Fan Club or the unofficial Coca-Cola Fan Club or whatever, I would be cautious of how you use things in your name, because those companies can come back and sue you if you are not the owner of that trademark, that copyright, that name. So I would just be super careful with that. And then also search for other podcast names that are like yours. Now, this is not 100% legal. You can still use the name, but be careful because make sure it's not copyrighted. So if somebody has a copyright on the name, don't use it. Like I wouldn't try to use something like maybe Podcast Answers or Dudes and Dads Podcast, which is my other podcast, because it's a kind of a specific name. But you can use things like Let's Talk or Let's Talk About It or Real Talk. But the one thing you have to know about those is lots of podcasts have Let's Talk or Real Talk or Let's Get Real or Let's Talk or things like that. So your podcast isn't going to stand out because it's going to be hard to find. Because if I search for Let's Talk About It, 150 other shows are going to come up, and those may or may not be yours. So you do need to be careful about naming your podcast because you don't want to put a product name in there, but you also want to not use a name that's so generic that people aren't going to find your podcast. So those are the things that I would say that you need to consider about when you're thinking about the legal issues of your podcast. And again, this is not 100% exhaustive list, but these are just some things that I thought of about legally and copywriting, copyright issues that could come into play in your podcast. So with that, though, I did say that I was going to recommend a podcast lawyer. And that person is Gordon Firemark. And Gordon is a lawyer, but he's also specializes in podcasting topics. He's a podcaster himself. And so he's very, very familiar with issues that can come up to podcasters. In fact, he's the one that kind of gave me the template that I use for the podcasting release form for my guests. And this is a generic thing. He didn't give it specifically to me, but he had it on his site. And so I used it because I wanted to cover my basis on my guests to make sure that I wasn't going to be in violation and I wanted to cover myself there. So I would check out Gordon Firemark if you are going to be looking for a podcast lawyer. So guys, I was thinking about doing something for this podcast. Would you like to see this podcast in video form in your podcast app? Now, I do post this live. We do a live YouTube video, and I also post the video to YouTube after the fact. But I do stream audio live in new podcasting apps because some new podcasting apps can show a live audio and live video feed of the podcast episode. You get alerted in it when your favorite show goes live. And for me, I go live a little bit early before any other app, any other place. Like, so YouTube, I don't start the podcast on YouTube for a little while, but I do normally start the audio stream early. And the reason I do that is kind of a little bit more of a behind the scenes look into that. And so I do start that early. And so I can do that live video also in podcasting apps. So if that's something that you would like to see, I'm looking for some people to partner with me. It'll be about $10 a month or so. And with doing that, I can provide live video while recording in some of the podcast apps. If you want to help provide that, get in contact with me, hello@podcastanswers.com, because I would love to do that. And then I'm also thinking about starting a service for other podcasters to use that they can stream live video to. So again, if you want to help me out and stream this video live on new podcast apps, $10 a month will get you there. hello@podcastanswers.com. Guys, have a safe week. Happy Thanksgiving. And just keep on podcasting.